Welcome back to Men and the City. Today I am standing atop Castillo de San Felipe de Barajas, which is the castle built by the Spaniards some 500 years ago to protect the city of Cartagena, which you can see behind me. Now I'm coming to you today from this location because the topic of today's video is going to be Holy War is coming. And war is a topic that we've talked about at length on this channel. I've made various videos about it, approaching it from different angles. But as most of you know, and to those of you who are new to my channel, I believe that war is imminent. And I believe that that war is more or less going to be a clash between civilization in various forms and globalism. Globalism, the subversive, the oppressive revolution from above that has been imposed upon us by bankers, by mainstream media elites, by the globalists, or as I call them, the gerontocracy. But holy war is coming because the forces of globalism, which are centered in Washington, D.C., in Brussels and in London and New York City, in the big banks, they have seen fit to change the world to their liking. But over the last 2 decades plus, the world has changed. And what has effectively happened is a retrenchment around the world. Castles, fortifications, defensive positions have been built. They've been built by countries like Russia and China and India and Iran and many other countries around the world that are more or less drawing lines in the sand in different fault lines in this global conflict that has just begun. Now, what causes war is, like anything else, very complicated, but the way I want to frame it today is based on the work of a man named Kenneth Waltz, who wrote a very famous book called Man, the State, and War, in which he argued that there were basically 3 causes for war. One to be found in the nature of man himself, his wickedness, inherent fallibility, maybe his misunderstanding or his ignorance. Number 1. Number 2 was the nature of states themselves. These are the broader societies that are entrenched in national bureaucracies and militaries and so forth that have their own interests. Sometimes they aggregate the interests of the populations they represent, sometimes they don't. And the third image is the nature, the structure, the power dynamics in the world in general. And from that vantage point, I think we can attack this problem very intelligibly. So let's start with the global community. As I have said on various videos on my channel, and I think it's increasingly dawning on those of us in the West, the balance of power in the world is changing. Now, it's very hard for people in the West, especially those who live in the epicenters of power, places like London, maybe Paris, maybe Berlin, maybe Washington, D.C. It's somewhat difficult for those folks to understand that. But for those of us that have traveled, it's fairly obvious that a major shift in the power dynamics in the world has occurred. And there are many reasons for this, but I think the leading reason, more than anything else, is the mismanagement, is the systematic decline, obsolescence, inefficiencies that are just now beginning to shake up the Western world. And more of that is to come. But an appropriate proxy for that, of course, is finance, because Western governments are bankrupt. They're spending all of their money on healthcare programs or on pension programs or on the salaries of government bureaucrats, or they're spending money to provide for illegal immigrants or refugees. They have not spent their money wisely, and so the largesse of the wealth that was created some 30, 40, or 50 years ago is running out. And it's running out not just because of the expense that these governments are carrying, but also because the industrial capacity has been hollowed out. And it's been done so systematically that the West at this point can't realistically scale the kind of military power that they once had. But of course, to the ideologues inside the liberal international order or inside the West, they don't know that. They think in ideological terms. And so they think that America's power, that the West's power is as great as it's ever been because it's about our ideas. Well, part of the reason I wanted to make the video today from the site that I'm in is because you can see what the nature of empire really looks like. It is not forged in ideas. It's forged in blood and demography. It's about violence. It's about military power. It's about industry. It's about economy. Those are the things that make or break empire, not ideas. The rest of the world at the same time, the Chinese, the Brazilians, the Persians in Iran, the Turks, and countless other groups, while their countries have serious problems, they have overpopulation, they have corruption, they have mismanagement of their own, they have nonetheless focused on the core competencies that can strengthen their positions in the world. They have prioritized national economic interests to the benefit of national governments and their populations. So as the West gets weaker because of ideological delusion and narcissism, the rest of the world has gotten stronger. And within that framework, as I've said, there is a shift in the balance of power. And that shift is beginning to resonate, it's beginning to register with the bureaucrats in DC, and instead of managing that shift, what they're doing is they're trying to fight against it. So the first image, ladies and gentlemen, is the international community. And the international community is experiencing the greatest shift in the balance of power that I think we've seen in the last 500 years, since the ascension of global Western power really began. Ironically, in places like Cartagena, where I am as we speak. Well, what about the next image? What about national governments? Well, inside countries around the world, there is a return to nationalism. There is a kind of purging, a blowing out of a lot of the ideological nonsense that's been promulgated through the Western world. Now, that seems to contradict what a lot of people, especially tourists from the West, think. When they come to places like Colombia, maybe they go to China, maybe they go to Thailand, maybe they go to other parts of the world, and what they see are McDonald's and Starbucks. Maybe they see KFC, and they see the spread of this vulture capitalist model that to some degree is poisoning populations beyond the West. And that's true, that is happening. But if you look deeper, what's actually happening is a heightened sense of identity. Countries around the world, especially in South and East Asia, are gaining strength again. They are convalescing and are nearly healed from being dominated over the last 100 to 200 years. And that is not an offensive perspective, meaning it's not a weapon that the rest of the world is trying to use against the West, as much as they're trying to create castles and fortifications, a Maginot Line, if you will, a retrenchment to push Western influence back. And remember that since the end of World War II, the West, subversively, overtly, and otherwise, has been shaping the destinies of peoples around the world through the governments that represent them. And it hasn't gone all that well for many peoples. In Colombia itself, you've had violent revolutions, you've had terrorist groups, you have narco states in various parts of Latin America. Now, much of that has nothing to do with the West, but some of it does. And there's no question that intelligence agencies in the Western world have been meddling in the affairs of distant lands for a long time to the detriment of the populations that they represent. Well, that period of time, that paradigm is coming to an end, in part because nations are stabilizing, they're retrenching, and they're beginning to channel that national consciousness that defines these places around the world. Colombia is a good example. Colombia is not a colonial structure anymore. It's not a product of the Spanish Empire. The legacy of that empire, which you can see in statues and various fortifications like the castle I'm standing on right now, those are monuments to the past. They don't represent the future. And the same thing is happening in China, it's happening in India, it's happening all over the world. So national governments are channeling economic nationalism, they're channeling a national identity and consciousness that's saying to the Western world, your days of dominance, of interfering in our affairs arbitrarily at your discretion and not ours, those are over. So what about the third and final image? Well, this I think is perhaps the most transformative effect of them all, and that is what I have referred to as radicalization. Something is happening in the psyches of men around the world. I think it is most acute, I think it is most potent in Western countries where masculinity has been attacked, it's been emasculated, it's been subverted or sabotaged for the better part of half a century. And men, average men, high value men, whatever you want to call them, are figuring this out. And they're coming to the realization that they've been sold a lie called materialism. And materialism has told them, sleep with as many women as you possibly can, accumulate as many resources as you can, and if you don't, you're a loser, you're nothing. Well, that mentality is poisonous. It's counterproductive, it's self-destructive. And so men in the West are opening their minds to a new ethos, a neo-masculinity. They are beginning to revisit questions of faith and identity. That is the future, that is where we're headed. And it's not unique to the West either. It's happening in all kinds of regions in different ways as populations begin to have a renewed sense of self-confidence in themselves. Now, this is not to say that war is inevitable on this basis. In fact, if the West were more competently run, if we were not dominated by a globalist parasite, then potentially war could be averted. But because of the tremendous churn of this social change happening in the minds of men, happening in the self-confidence of nations, and happening in the shift in the balance of power around the world, we are fast approaching a holy war. And most of you know where that holy war is going to be fought. It's going to be fought in the Middle East and in other core fault lines around the world. But the Middle East is crucial. It is the epicenter. What's really happening there, and the reason that this war is only going to continue to escalate, it's only going to continue to intensify and spread, and unfortunately, it's going to bring in other powers that are going to enlarge the conflict far beyond what it is today, is a holy war between the forces of Zionism who dominate Israel and to a lesser extent the Western world, and the House of Islam. That's what's really happening. But the House of Islam is not operating in a vacuum anymore, meaning they're not dominated necessarily by tributary or vassal states of the Western world. Even in the Middle East, you're starting to see a turnover in the mentality and the psyches of governments there who sense the shift in power as well. So they're looking towards Eurasia. They're looking east, not west. And so in the corner of the House of Islam is not simply the billion to 2 billion Muslims in the world. It's not simply the Arabs, the Persians, the Turks, and more. It's also the Chinese. It's also the Russians. It's also the Indians, who, for a combination of reasons, depend on those Gulf states. They need the energy, they need the oil, the natural gas. But they also have a vested interest in pushing back on globalism, the perversion of Western power around the world. They don't want that cancerous spread any more than the Arab states do. And so this is coming to a head. And it's coming to a head because the state of Israel has asymmetric power. It has undue influence in the United States and in Europe. And so various European states, when they should be backing down, when they should be de-escalating, when they should be saying, we need to find a diplomatic way out, what are they saying? They're doubling down. They are escalating their rhetoric. And at the same time, the rest of the world, who has a vested interest in the shift in balance of power, but not a violent transition to that shift, they are trying to send warning signs. They're launching cosmetic strikes, as the Iranians just did against Israel. In other words, they recognize what's happening and that the West is sort of spiraling out of control and is being dominated utterly by this very desperate power that we call the State of Israel. They're trying to avoid any open conflict, but I'm sad to say I don't think that that conflict is going to be avoided for the reasons that I've mentioned. The Israelis are desperate. They perceive their situation to be hopeless unless they push back comprehensively, categorically, against the balance of power shift that I have discussed in this video. They're aware of it. They know that the West is teetering. They know that their time of dominance over Western governments is coming to an end. And so how do you address the fragility of the situation that they face? And remember that from their vantage point, if they do not reassure their populations that they have total asymmetric military control of the Middle East, that they can dominate any neighboring Arab power or Persian or Turkish army that comes into their zone, into their ken, that the populations will lose confidence in them and begin to leave Israel. That is a catastrophic development that they cannot tolerate. And so they're going to escalate and do what they see as necessary to bring the Western world into the fray. And I think they're going to succeed. However, in succeeding, they will fail, because the Western world, for the reasons that most of you know and I have just sketched, is weak. It's not as powerful as it once was, certainly not relative to the rest of the world, which has become more powerful, more self-confident, more narrowly focused on national interests. And so our support, if a war of the magnitude, a holy war between the forces of globalism and civilization does in fact occur, our support in the United States, in the UK, in France, and Germany is brittle. It will break like glass, and the Israelis will be left all by their lonesome. That is how this is going to go. The change in Western governments, the change in the psyches of men in the West is also going to come to the front. It's going to surge into the power vacuum as the months and years ahead warrant, because of the tremendous damage that this conflict is going to cause. It's going to destroy the economy. It's going to vaporize the creditworthiness of Western governments, who, remember, are dependent like infants inside their mother's womb, umbilically or otherwise. They are dependent on foreign creditors, and they're rocking the boat because they see the world through the prism of ideology and not in terms of the balance of power or a shift in the psyches of men. Ladies and gentlemen, holy war is upon us. I do not believe it is the end. It is not Armageddon. It is not the final denouement of human civilization on this planet. But it is going to bring down Western governments, and there is going to be a realization, probably fought and suffered in blood, of the balance of power that I have discussed in this video. We are living in exciting times, and on the other side of this destructive conflict is going to be a much better world, a saner world, a world that's more in touch with faith and identity, not less. But unfortunately, we have to go through this crucible first. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.